Well, we want to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. Today I'm joined by the pastors. Rick, Steve, and Ed are here, and we are going to be jumping into a topic that we started last week. But before we jump in, how are you guys doing today? We
Good.
Good. Not too bad.
Yeah.
As I say, it's.
Like
I
it to
keep
be
telling
warmer.
myself, yes, as the temperature does not rise, I keep telling myself it's closer to being that.
That's right.
Whenever that is, it would be nice if spring gave a little more warmth, but at least there's no white stuff on the ground.
Right.
And today's a dry day, so as it's the day that we're recording it is the kickoff for spring track season. Today's the first day of competition. You said Girard Northwestern.
Yep, kicking off.
Is today, so that's a big one.
Yep.
And then we have Mercier's Prep coming our way. So we will be in full swing this afternoon, and so it'll be a little frigid. I don't expect the performances to be like any knockout of the park because it won't even be 40 degrees, but we'll get it done. No, and that's at this point. That's like you just don't want to like have it rescheduled and everything else thrown off. So beginning of the season, it's good to get some competition in, but you realize that once it gets warm, then everyone does better. I got to imagine it, like thinking baseball wise, it feels a little different on the hands when you get a hit in this cold weather.
I've been surprised they have gotten a decent amount of games in already. I was kind of shocked by that.
Right.
They're already going for it. So
I think maybe the third week, I don't know, I forget the exact day because we never scheduled this early, but the third week in March is when you can officially start competing in spring sports.
Oh, nice.
So like the first Monday in March is when everything kicks off, and then there's like a 2.5, 3 week period of no competition, but then you can start. And so it's not been warm this spring, but the fields have been pretty clear. We only got snow a couple more times after that. So
It was warm when Seth and the Girard baseball team went to Florida.
Well, yeah, I was going to say it was
Nice
warm down
warm
there.
down
That
there.
was nice.
Seth really sacrificing.
Yeah, I know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, go down there.
Oh, that is good. It's that's good for the teams do those trips. Our girls softball team at Fairview went out to Kentucky or Tennessee or something. I don't know. I forget, but they didn't go all the way down, but they definitely were in warmer weather, and got a chance to play a couple weeks ago, which was good for them. But today we are going to be talking. We just finished up the series in total on Elijah and Elisha, and what lessons from God that we can learn. Last episode we talked about Elijah, and today we're going to be looking at Elisha and talking through his story just a little bit because he covers a lot more ground, and so we're not going to dive into all of it, but there's a couple different situations with his call, and then the time the story with Naaman and all of that we're going to touch base on. But when you look at Elisha's story overall, whether it was something we covered in one of the sermons or a lot of the other stuff even outside of that scripture talks about Elisha, as you read and study over the years and, even this time around, what has been something that has stood out about his character or maybe something that you've admired about Elisha?
Well, I was blessed when Steve did the message on him just to realize how serious the commitment he made.
Yeah.
I'd read the thing about him, burning the yoke and killing the oxen and stuff.
Yeah.
And I never really contemplated. I mean, he gave up everything.
Yeah.
He absolutely laid it all on the line for somebody who just walked up to him and said, "Here's my cloak,"
Yeah.
So I was impressed. I've preached many times, and I did this time on Elijah, and I really, really like Elijah.
Yeah.
But I'd never really taken seriously how committed Elisha was strictly on the basis of Elijah walking up to him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to assume that God had been speaking to Elisha. And I'm more impressed with Elisha than I ever have been before. Let's
Yeah,
put it that
yeah.
way.
Yeah.
That's good. What are some other things that have stood out to you about Elisha when you've studied him?
He doesn't seem to be quite the complainer that Elijah is. Elijah seems, which
Yeah.
I actually feel more akin to Elijah
Yeah,
than
yeah.
Elisha, because Elisha, he's from the start he just seems driven that that position was something that, you know, whether God had been talking to him beforehand, he must have been hearing about Elijah's ministry, and really wanted to. Seemed honored to accept the call and jumped right in. So he seems a lot less, of a pity guy, about
Yeah.
the life that he's got to lead, because Elisha did have a pretty good life going, and he was ready to give that right up to serve the Lord. So
Yeah.
it's a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I just think I was reminded about how how much he he mirrored the ministry of Jesus in the sense, even more than Elijah, because he did some things that Jesus directly did.
Yeah.
I mean, they both healed, brought somebody back from the dead, but only Elisha multiplies the food, just like Jesus multiplied the
Yeah.
loaves, and Jesus healing lepers. Elisha does that. So just the amount of things that Elisha did that Jesus did, and
Yeah.
foreshadowing of that was brought back to my attention as I read through his story. He definitely, even though, like you say, most of us think more about Elijah than Shah. I mean, probably because of the great, mountain thing experience of calling down fire.
Right.
If you took away that story, we'd probably think more about Elisha, maybe.
Yeah.
Because Elisha really did get, a double portion, and he did greater things, I think, than Elijah, although they both did great things, so it's hard to quantify those two things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we didn't get to it, but one thing I've always that's fascinated me about Elisha is later on in 2 Kings when, the Syrian army is hunting them down and they're in the city and surrounding the city, and the servant wakes him up and is panicking, and Elisha just seems calm. And I'm not saying he's nonchalant about it, but like calm and just simply prays, God, open his eyes to see what I see.
Yeah.
And then, the armies of the Lord that are there protecting them, and they just walk through the Syrian army and like go to safety. And so there's an element of, Elisha just being in tune with God and with the Spirit, and really being steady in his ministry, and just what that meant for him, and in his awareness. And part of that probably was the double portion he prayed for, and God's allowing him to be more aware of what was going on and what God was doing on his behalf and on really on the behalf of the nation. And so I've always appreciated that, and always been curious, like, how often was he seeing what was going on? Because it would almost drive you mad, like if you were always seeing everything, but it was just an interesting thing, because in that moment he saw what was going on just from being woken from a sleep,
Right.
and prayed that his servant could see that as well. But it's been something that's always fascinated me, about Elisha, and just appreciated about him. We talked a little bit, Pastor Ed, you talked about his call, and Elisha's call in the ministry was distinct, and it came as he was working in the field, and a cloak was placed on him. And so what are some things that stood out to you that were unique about his call, and not just that, but his reaction?
Yeah, I think the fact that he had to catch back up with Elijah. It says he ran after Elijah after he put the cloak on him. So that right there, it was like instant. He wasn't like, wow, what should I do here? He responds immediately. So that stood out to me for sure this time around. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, just how prompt his reaction was. It just, he's in the midst of his work.
Mm-hmm.
And as Steve, I think, pointed out in his sermon, if he had 12 yoke of oxen, then he had a lot of employees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
He had a big thing going, business-wise,
Yeah.
and life-wise at that point. But his response to the calling was immediate. All he asked was, "Can I go and say goodbye to my parents?"
Yeah.
That's all he asked, and it was immediate. He was ready. He was willing to go. And I mean, the way the text reads, Elijah say anything?
I think he did. He said, "What have I done to you?"
Yeah, well,
Again,
Go back.
it's just
He says, "Go back."
Go back.
Yeah.
So what have I done to you? Even though God's calling of Elisha to Elijah was, "Hey, you're going to call Elisha, and he's going to make sure."
Oh, yeah.
So he was giving a definitive that Elisha is the guy, and he is going to do this. So there was no question, or shouldn't have been any question in Elijah's mind, but yet he's the one who questions in that moment. Elisha's all in, and Elijah's like, "Ugh, go back. What have I done to you?" It's like, no, this is the guy, stop trying to put a stumbling block, in front of him. But
Even though he knew what he was calling him to.
exactly. He knew he was called, and this was the right guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and God said that Elijah was supposed to go and anoint Elisha, but you have no. This is the lowest grade anointing I've ever seen. This is when David when Samuel anoints David. It's an anointing. It's the oil. It's a blessing. But here, Elijah's there's no record of that. Plus, he's like, like you say,
Must have been some coat. That's for sure.
The coat is about the only thing that represents
Coat that he tries to take with him to heaven.
Yeah. But it was, like you said, it was very low level.
Low key.
It was immediately Elijah left and made Elisha go after him. And then, even then it's like, hey, man, just forget about it. Now that I'm thinking, and maybe part of it, and not to assume too much, but maybe part of it was Elijah saw Elisha in practice and saw what he was asking him to walk away from and was like, man, just forget it, and having that. I also did like you talking through the uniqueness of he not only left, but he took the time to what he was working with at that time to burn the yoke, to cook the oxen, slaughter the oxen, cook it for his staff. And he went to say goodbye to his parents, but there's no sign of, hey, so this is who I think would be best to take over for me. Like, this is who I was raising up or whatever. And so I think you alluded to it in the very beginning. You have to believe that God was already working on his heart to prepare him, that if not specifically this was coming, that something was coming. And he knew enough that he knew who Elijah was, and he knew what his cloak represented. Like, he was not confused. He didn't ask any questions like, what are you doing? Like, who are you? What's going on? Like, there was an element of he had an understanding of what exactly was happening and was ready to answer the call.
But and the reality, though, at least according to the text that we have, Elijah, 3.5 years before, got the word from the Lord. Then God hid him for 3 years. Then you have the Mount Carmel thing, and right after that, Elijah runs. So he's out of commission, and so really, Elisha has only heard about Elijah. At this point. Now, he is going to accept the call, and he is going to walk with him then.
For years.
For quite a while.
But
at the point of the calling, man, what a just what courage, and just I'm gonna go. I've heard about you.
Yeah.
I think it really does show that Elijah really thinks that surely nobody would want this job. It really does show that people are watching you and seeing what you're doing. And so I think Elijah's thinking that I've got the worst gig. He's telling God there's nobody left.
Yeah.
And God shows him that, I've saved these who haven't bent the knee to Baal. But you obviously have guys like Elisha who are ready to serve God at a drop of a hat, which God knew that, So I think it's a good reminder for everyone in ministry that, your work is being watched. People are watching you, and, we are replaceable. God's not going to leave a ministry hanging, and we need to be aware of that. Where Elijah, I think, was like, "This is it.
Yeah.
I'm the last." And they're like, no, God fully has another guy ready to go and who loves the Lord just as much as you do and wants to serve him. And you see a lot of humility, and we'll talk more about that, but you just see a lot of humility with Elisha, ready to serve the Lord and to serve Elijah and learn from him. So it's a good example there.
Now, talk through your calling into full-time vocational ministry as a pastor, because obviously I know your guys' stories. Some people listening might know your stories, but I'm almost certain like no one came up to you with a cloak and put it over your shoulder and it was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm going to do. I know the example of your parents was a great one of with them praying through and really had to basically, say, okay, God, if nothing happens to this point, that's you saying that you want us to go into full-time ministry. But it would have been a lot easier if, Clark Rose would have come up and put a cloak on him and, and like, Youth for Christ.
The Youth for Christ hoodie.
Youth guidance is exactly,
You're in.
Yeah, you're in. This is exactly what's going on, And to be honest, I mean, obviously, if it was someone like this, maybe it'd be different. But even if someone did walk up and put a cloak on us, we'd be like, I don't know. Like, I got a question, are you really hearing from God and all those things? So how did God bring you through that process to let you know that he was calling you into full-time vocational ministry as a pastor?
Well, you want to start with me?
Sure.
Okay.
As I say, we'll go in chronological order. We'll start with that. Yeah.
Okay. It started as a teenager here in this church, and Dr. Augustine gave me and other ones my age opportunity to stand up in front and either give a testimony or play my trumpet or whatever, and even to speak early on. So I went off to college thinking at that point I was going to be a music major. I didn't know what that meant, but I learned...
Means you have no life.
Yeah.
You spend time in a music room.
I learned in the first...
nonstop.
I learned in the first week if I was going to be a music major, I would give my soul to the music department. That was it. That's all that I would do. I realized, no, that's not what I'm called to.
Yeah.
So then it was just a matter of just seeking the Lord. I ended up going to seminary and getting into youth ministry with Youth for Christ. And good experiences and all. And then I would come home in the summer and work at the WLD Ranch. And again, good, ministry experiences. But as far as being a pastor, two things really shaped that. One was getting involved in a local church in Chicago, where I had the privilege of being under a pastor who just had a vision of getting younger men and giving them opportunity. And I had a privilege to do an internship, you might say, with David Maines. And I distinctly remember at certain points thinking, this is where I really feel fulfilled. This is where I feel like I'm being called. Then I came home to summer WLD Ranch, and in the early years we were just doing kids ministries, but we decided to try a family camp.
Yeah.
And so we were divvying up the assignments on the staff. Okay, who's going to work with the children? Who's going to work with the teenagers? And then who's going to work with the adults? And the whole rest of the staff said children and teens. Who's going to work with the adults? Well, it basically fell to me.
Yeah.
So I did a morning, morning Bible teaching kind of thing. And first of all, I found out, gosh, I really like this.
Yeah.
And then it's another whole long story, but we were under some criticism for some things that we were doing out there.
Still hadn't got a haircut. No.
Well, the hair was the least of the issues
yeah.
at that point. But we were under some criticism, and one of the women who was very, very critical of what we were doing out there came up to me after one of the morning sessions of teaching, and she said, I just learned so much from your teaching. Wow. And it just started to click that I was more suited for ministering to adults. A little side note, in Youth for Christ, I thoroughly enjoyed it, but I recognized we work our tails off with these kids, and then they go home. And a lot of the parents totally cancel out what we've tried to do with their kids.
Yeah.
So somebody's got to get through to the parents. So that little element, all of those factors really moved me in the direction of being a pastor.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I wouldn't say definitely wasn't. I don't have any dramatic calling kind of story.
Well, after your first time here, you're like, I'm not going back there. No,
Yeah,
to a certain degree.
Right, right.
And then, God had different plans. No.
No. So I could see that God had a plan, but I wouldn't say that was forefront in my mind, because I was being ministry trained a lot of my life, being involved at the boys' gym club.
Yeah.
Then even I went to Houghton during some backsliding years, and I went there only because I wanted to go to a pre-law program, and it was pretty good.
Yeah.
And there was a guy who attended my church who said I should go there. And that was about how much thought went into it.
Right.
Well, the third factor was it was close enough home. I could come home on weekends and still party with my friends. So that was the third factor.
So,
and bring my laundry, too.
Yeah.
But, there was no, dramatic call to go to Houghton and be a pastor. Not at all. So when I went and then got in the pre-law thing, and in the middle of my freshman year, when I had a dramatic re-encounter with the Lord, that changed everything. But even then, I wasn't thinking I'm going to be a pastor.
Yeah.
I just I didn't know. So I did kind of like Ed. I went into music full time.
Yeah.
So I did a full-time music major thing for about a year and a half, and then I figured out, I really don't want to do, this either. So then I was just trying to get out of college with a degree. And they started a new degree called church ministry. So I said, I can dive into that. All my credits will pretty much transfer, and I'll be able to get out of here almost on time.
Yeah.
I still stayed the last summer and had to get finished. But even then, I was traveling in these summer groups all summer doing ministry. But it never really, clicked to me until I was standing in line getting my fake diploma in June. Because I still had to go this summer, but they let me walk and grab it with all my teammates.
That's right.
So that was cool. But a girl who came to church here said, hey, you might be looking for a job. Well, our church that I go to, she was our piano player all these years, said, there's a teen choir position open. I said, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but I've got 8 weeks of school to do here. But as I got about the fourth week into school and realized, I do need a job when this is all done. I got to pay these school loans. I called her and I said, is that job still open? Long story short, I had a meeting with Pastor Wayne and another guy in Jamestown, actually. He tells me about the job a little bit. I said, okay, I'll come in. I could tell I qualified for that.
Yeah.
So, but I came. I did take some other interviews, a couple other places, got offered a couple of different jobs. But I was like, I just don't feel like that's it. So I came here for a weekend, And, long story short, it wasn't a dramatic weekend. We had the ladies with the cowbells playing hymns. It was not dramatic. It was dramatic, but not in a good way.
Everybody needs more cowbell.
Yeah, that was on a Sunday night.
Yeah, it was a Sunday night. I was taking an interview
I
on
remember those Sunday nights. They were brutal.
Yeah. And I was taking an interview on the Monday, and I said, well, I'll still take the interview because it's good to take interviews.
Yeah.
But that was with Wayne, and but he invited me to come back the next. He didn't know I was even here the night before, and I didn't confess it. I did not confess it because I didn't even stay for the end of the service.
Yeah.
But I came back the next weekend totally different. There was a full teen choir up there. It was teen and college at that time because it was summer.
Okay.
They let everybody. A lot of good things. So basically, long story short, I came here feel like I don't know. Again, I didn't feel like this aha calling moment. I just felt like I need a job. This place wants me. Looks good. So
let's try it out.
Let's try it out, right? And that really was what I thought. Maybe a year of seeing how what I like, what I don't like. But long story short, God just kind of gradually. The weirdest thing was in our setting that you're hired one week, known as a 22-year-old named Rick Plucknett, and by the next Sunday, people are saying, "Hi, Pastor Rick."
Yeah.
And I'm turning around like, are you talking to me? Yeah. I'm Pastor Rick now?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Wow. Because I didn't hardly have any Bible classes even
Honors
in college.
and titles.
I know.
I took like 2 Bible classes. That was it because you had to. But most of mine was Christian ed and music. And so that was kind of a dramatic change. And so, but anyway, over the years, I think God confirmed a calling there. But I didn't have any kind of aha dramatic moment, maybe like Pastor Ed did there. Yeah. But that's my story, and stick to it, I guess.
Yep. Yeah, I think I gave a little bit of mine in the sermon, but during my high school and college years, working out at the ranch was really formational, and Malcolm and Anna seeing something in me that I was a CIT one year, and the next year they offered me to be the camp coordinator, which is a little bit more responsibility and leadership, which again, I thought was great. So they definitely saw something in me as far as ministry wise. And I definitely felt in college, like I said, my freshman year, a calling into ministry. What that was, I wasn't sure. But to me, it didn't really make much sense. There was a couple people that had spoken into my life almost kind of saying that they don't see that in me, and I kind of hung on to that, know. But it was the same. Unfortunately, I was listening to people that hadn't seen me at a camp, where growing up with your brother who's in the same grade, we're not twins, but we're in the same grade. When one acts super crazy, I kind of just was different then. But if my brother wasn't around, sometimes I would get crazy then, kind of like the Pettises can get, know. But it was just, I think back on that now, how different I was at different times, depending on, if my family member, which family member was around, and it's nothing to say about my brother Matt there, because he just had, and people definitely felt he was called to ministry too, or more so than I was. So I remember in college kind of poo-pooing that part of it, because I was like, criminal justice makes more sense, I'm going to go that route. Plus, I started just living kind of wildly, living for myself during the school year, and then summer I'd go out to the camp and give my all to the Lord, and I just kind of try to live that 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So I think that definitely had an impact. So then when I graduated, got into a couple jobs, but then landed as a juvenile probation officer, but really reconnecting here and being a part of the young adult program. I really enjoyed being a part of the leadership here. Yeah. And then, like I said, I got invited to go to the Willow Creek Summit in Chicago, which I really thought was quite an honor. I was like, this is cool, hanging out with, these older guys, which I really liked. I actually really enjoy hearing people's opinions that you grew up with, like the older guys, because you really get to know what they really believe. I enjoyed that. Yeah. So I really enjoyed the weekend, and then at some point during the weekend, I really felt God stirring about ministry, and specifically with youth, which I hadn't really dived in at that point yet, still with young adults. And we were in need of someone to jump in, to come in as an interim youth director for a year. And as far as I knew, no one filled that position. So I felt God stir. What about you? And so I mentioned Pastor Rick, hey, I feel like a stirring about, and I'm willing to kind of put my hat in the ring, sort of thing. And he's like, hey, that's great. Well, we've already hired someone, Paula, but why don't you come and help? And so I was like, yeah, I really knew some of the seniors that year, and I wanted to come in and help. I didn't really know Paula at all. So I was like, yeah, I want to help. And Kevin Nagel, Katie Morales, who was Katie Bell at the time, she wanted to jump in. So I was excited because like some of my friends were jumping in to help. So I really enjoyed that year. And then it was the year after that, Paula became the full-time youth director. But they were looking for someone to kind of be with her. There was a kind of a rough crowd that would be out there.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways, Rick had heard what the Lord had said, but in some ways also kind of wanted someone out there that, might be able to handle a situation, which, as it turned out, Paula was more of a heavy than I was. Physically, I could handle a couple situations, but mostly Paula was like laying down the law. I was like, come on. I was the youth. The probation officer was like, give him another chance, you know. But served with Paula as an intern, then as a part-time. So God really was speaking to me in that moment. That was something Paula said, I should have reiterated during my sermon, that God was giving me the calling then. And then when she felt the Lord calling her to stay home with raising the family, that left the position open. And I can't say I responded like Elisha, where, I was like immediate, but I definitely felt like, man, the Lord had been opening these doors, and I'm going to walk through. I'm going to leave working at juvenile probation, which wasn't, the best paying job, but it was, I definitely saw myself retiring from there. I mean, I loved the work. I liked working with young people and working in the inner city there. I actually enjoyed doing that. And, but the Lord had other plans. And so that's kind of how God had called me into ministry. And I think, definitely more reluctant than Elisha for sure. But just being obedient to the doors that he opened from then on out, when I really felt his call there at the Willow Creek Summit, and, going from there. So,
and I think, my story is very similar, and I'll just be very brief about, it was a series of, without thinking much, asking God and saying yes to volunteer opportunities, and just continuing to say yes when opportunities arose. I had no desire to get out of education. I loved it, felt that I was doing my best to make an impact with youth at the high school level and coaching. And so there was just a series of yeses that at the end of it, all of a sudden, there was a job offer to be a pastor, and it was just like, oh my goodness. And then really, seeking God even more in that short season, Angie and I, and in the end of it, feeling that God was calling me into full-time vocational ministry. But I think that the similarity, I know that there was never a cloak or anything presented to us, but I think just like Elisha had the call, had the cloak placed on him, but then taken back for almost a decade, depending on, what commentary and what, but I mean, we know it was for years. And then he did apprentice.
Yep.
Like he was not just called and then stepped right into head prophet, or whatever, like there was a mentoring process, and there was a learning and a training, like we see in scripture a lot of times, and that process through. And so it reminds us of the importance of discipleship and mentorship and being trained up for what you're called to do. And I'd love to just speak to right now, who is it in your life that is currently discipling you? We know the importance of mentorship and being discipled, but who in your life currently is God using to disciple you?
Yeah, when I read that question, I was thinking, well, I don't know if we look at it like that. We look at it more as I think, accountability. But, the guy I meet with who's a retired pastor, I think does at times speak into my life. but it's more. I don't know if either one of us would come out saying, "Hey, I'm discipling you," or "You're discipling me," but I think there's that accountability is part of that discipleship.
Yeah.
And and that's important. I still feel like, I'm learning things from everybody in this room and from people in our congregation, our elders. I'm still feel like there's like a Jim Rickard disciples me in how I should love some people more.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I feel like I'm catching it. I don't know if it's like a formal. He's sitting me down and saying,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think you gotta constantly have that. I want to learn from other people mindset.
Right.
I think it is good to have at least one person who you're sitting down with and being accountable
intentionally
to that.
right.
on a regular basis.
But just to have that, I want to learn from everybody, in this church, especially those who are elders, because I think every elder has a strength to them that we can all learn from. So that's, I guess, my answer to that.
Yeah.
Who's discipling?
Yeah, I just think, I can't say growing up that I had someone that, met with me regularly, but I just kind of became a watcher, an observer, and so that's kind of how I grew up being trained for ministry, was watching, observing, and then doing. So with my dad being in ministry, I observed my parents in ministry for years. And then when opportunities came to do things, I would do them,
You were forced a lot too. I was to say, as
there was
kids,
definitely
some.
being forced, but no doubt being forced into the choir.
And
little did
I'm
I
saying
realize
that myself
Yeah,
as well,
little did I realize that would kind of push me to learn an instrument, which I never would have learned otherwise. I poorly learned the bass, and then I poorly learned the guitar. And singing, which I was definitely, like you said, I was against. But man, my dad made me participate.
Yeah,
in
you
some
didn't
things.
even make the cut for B&B, right?
Well, yeah.
No,
You
no, I
never
did
made
not
the
make
cut.
the cut. No,
Yeah.
I was so close. I did help them one time at a dinner theater.
You're a roadie?
Yeah, I was
You're
a
a
roadie.
roadie?
Yeah,
Oh,
which
yeah,
I enjoyed setting the
man.
chairs that they stepped on and came down on.
Oh,
Very
yeah.
dramatic.
Oh, very important.
We should
Very
promise
important.
our listeners a video of that sometime.
Yeah, I'm
Steve,
sure
if
we
you
can
pull
find
one
it.
up.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
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 Just
But
Oh man, there were no tryouts for that. No.
funny thing was,
There
is
would've been
actually
some
there
more
was
cuts.
a time where I did do a song with Ben and Brian. No Mal though, so
Oh,
I
yeah.
became Mal in a
Yes,
sense.
yes.
For it was like
Yeah.
that reunion.
Yeah.
Teen choir 20-year reunion thing we did. It was this raise money for Storm the Gates. I think we made
Oh no,
sure.
I was part of that.
Were you part of that? Did you
Yeah.
get in the song? Were you a part of the song, the jam we did? Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I totally forgot about that.
So you're
Yeah.
saying it could
Yeah.
have been BSB. It
Yeah,
could have been.
missed
It could have been.
opportunities.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like there's something else in there, but I'm just gonna keep
those
moving.
letters.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I think I got that.
I would say similar to what Pastor Rick is saying. There's allowing people to speak into your life. I think is critical, and I think that's the similar stage. I'm at now. Yeah.
Yeah, I made reference earlier to the early days, the mentoring experience. I was actually one of 5 interns from Trinity that were David Maines and his associates.
Yeah.
And that was a whole year's worth, and it was really a phenomenal experience. From that time on, I've always had a group of fellow pastors.
Yeah.
Wherever in Phoenix, I actually ended up the president of the Association of Evangelicals group in Phoenix, and Connie just pulled out a picture of me the other day with the mayor of Phoenix, picture from the newspaper. But I always had other pastors, interacting and discussing how are things going, how's God working in your life and in your church. So that's probably where my most effective, discipling kind of thing has happened. One of the blessings of coming back here and originally starting over, you might say, was that I could intentionally look for men that I could work with. And in that process, which has continued to this day, in that process, inevitably, I grow
Yeah.
You know, it just results. I'm working intentionally with them, but as I'm sharing with them, they're speaking to my life. And, and it's just, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I've always tried to have somebody, you know, currently I'm working with a couple of different guys, and I try to make myself accountable to them. I ask them to pray for me on things, you know.
Yeah.
And while I'm still trying to, you know, address their needs. So.
Yeah. And I know that throughout my life, God has blessed me tremendously, first with my father, and then also a ton of other great Christian men in this church, you know, in this room, and you know, whether it's accountability, whether it's mentorship, and walking along. And currently, I think God has blessed me with, you know, my accountability partner, Eric Wolf, who's a high school teacher, not in full-time ministry, and then Conrad Donaldson as a mentor. You know, that those are separate meetings for me, but they happen every other week. And Conrad, a former elder, you know, he's retired. He's been retired for a while, but just super involved at the ranch and, you know, at the church. And so it's great for them to be able to not just hold me accountable, but speak into my life. And, you know, especially with Conrad, who's further down the road, you know, I can bring him some concerns in life as a father and as a husband, and be like, hey, you know, have you ever seen this? Have you ever faced this? Like, how did you handle this? And, you know, and he is so gracious to be very transparent of like, well, this is how I handled it bad, you know, and this is how I handled it well, and this is what I've seen, you know, and it's just it's a tremendous thing, and it's a great reminder of the importance not just to be doing that, because as pastors we're always looking, well, at least we should always be looking to disciple others and be intentional to shepherd others. But if we're not careful, we're the ones that are always trying to pour out, and then we're not being intentional to be fed and held accountable and things like that. So just the real importance of that, whether you're a pastor or not in your life, to have that. So as we keep following Elisha's story, we see in 2 Kings 2, you know, it talks through, and I'm not going to read through the first 6 verses, but in the first 6 verses, the day has come. You know, the Lord's going to take Elijah up in a whirlwind to heaven. And 3 different times, Elijah's like, hey, just stay here. And Elisha's like, no, I'm going with you. The prophets are even coming to him being like, hey, you know, don't you know that your master's leaving today? Like, he's gone, and like, hey, just be quiet, shut up, you know? Yeah. And so there is really, it does seem to be that Elisha has a reluctance. You know, he's not super excited for, you know, Elijah's finally going to be gone and I'm finally going to be in charge, right. You know? And so, you know, we can speak to this uniquely over the years here at the church, and currently what we're going through as a church. But why is it valuable in a ministry transition to not be so eager to push the other person out of leadership? And to Steve, you're chuckling.
I think there are times where someone needs to go, but I think so. The things,
So like,
not in our case, though, Steve.
No. I was thinking more of like maybe someone that's like a no, like a moral fail. You know, I'm thinking there's other times where it's like, hey, someone needs to go. Sure. Not in our no.
Yeah,
I'm thinking in my mind, you just joke because there's sometimes like no, there's sometimes, and it mostly deals with like moral failings or something. You know,
and there's times, or if there's someone who I've heard, you know, I've talked to other churches where this person's like 80 and they just need to be out of leadership and they don't want to hand over the mantle. And, you know, so there's times where it needs to be more forcefully encouraged or, you know, gone through. And you would really hope and pray that person would hear from the Lord in that, you know, especially if they're leading ministry. But, you know, obviously with the transition, Ed, from you to Rick, and now as we're walking through this transition, you know, of Rick moving into retirement and just going through that, like, why is it valuable? Or I don't know, maybe you did throw a party when Ed approached you, you know, but it also wasn't like, hey, I really feel God's called me I'm giving my 2 weeks notice and then I'm out of here. Like it was a long process.
Right.
And in that process, just to respectfully wait and to not be trying to push him out, but then also in all reality, graciously being like, yes, like you stayed on as the associate pastor. Like it was a transition of roles, and what's the value of that, and why is that so important?
Well, what I've seen in our situation here, and I've compared this to a lot of other church situations, is you're attached to people. Church is people.
Yeah.
And people need a pastor, you know, but no one pastor is going to live forever. You know, the day is going to come when we're either going to go up in a fiery chariot or we're going to die. You know, and so
More likely B.
Yeah.
Right. But so the transition must occur, but it needs to be in God's time with careful preparation because you're dealing with people.
Yeah.
You know, and people are attached. People get attached to their pastor. And so it's for the sake of the people that that transitions need to be carefully laid out, and sudden departures are never good.
Yeah.
You know, my first experience actually was when I was going to leave the church in Phoenix, and it was kind of interesting. I mean, I was the pastor, and at that church, at the beginning of the calendar year, we would always the board members, the ministry leaders, and the pastor would say, here are our goals for this year. And we'd make it public. So I said to the church chairman, honestly, our goal for this year is going to be to leave, and to leave well.
Yeah.
And we believe we're supposed to leave at the end of the summer. So what do you think about my announcing that in January?
Yeah.
And he said, I've never heard of such a thing, but why not? Let's try it. So I announced it. And there was probably 2 or 3 weeks of people, pastor, you know.
Yeah.
But the rest of that time, it was fabulous.
Yeah.
And the committee to find my successor was able to start working right away, you know. It made it so much easier.
Yeah.
Really, for the people. They had time to get used to the idea that I was going to be leaving, you know. And when I left, it was wonderful. There wasn't any, you know, any
animosity,
mystery or anything. It was all out in the open, you know.
Yeah.
And the committee was already working on. I told them, you can have a candidate in even before I leave. I don't have to.
Yeah.
You know. As it turned out, they didn't. But it just you let it be known. You know, just like Rick has done here. You let it be known, and you give the people time. You give the elders, the leadership time to work on the transition.
Yeah.
It's better for the people. It's just better for the people.
Yeah. And I think there's also like, and this is obviously you need to be delicate about it, but in our situation, there's also an element of, first and foremost, you need to follow God's calling, and you need to honor God. That is who deserves all the honor. But there's an element of in our unique situation in these times, like you need to honor the person for their years of ministry. Like there's an element of respect and making sure, because of what has taken place, and no matter the transition, there's going to be a vacuum. You know, like there's elements that are done that, you know, it's people that are in charge do things that nobody realizes because they have to be done. You know, like there's an element of that. And so there's also, you know, from just a logistics standpoint, there's those things that need to be done, and it is just so much better when it's done over time. And there's a slower transition, and it's not like you and Kelly you're retiring and moving, you know, like that's not, you're not going anywhere, you know, but like there's still that element of transition where it's just going to be different, and making sure that all of those things, you know, are talked through and discussed, and, you know, and doing it in an honoring way. And the other unique thing is, like, again, you're not going anywhere, but this is 42 years of ministry here, you know? Right. And so, like, this is, we jokingly say, it's the only real job you've ever had. You had summer jobs all the time, and you worked in college, and, like, you know, of like, this is the one job you got out of college, and then just have always stayed here, you know? And just the tremendous testimony of that. And yeah, like, I think there's a definite value and need to be honoring to God in that process also. And so Elisha seemed in this case to really be wanting to honor God. We look at David's situation, in which was very, very different, you know, but he was honoring God the whole way. He never took Saul's life, could have done it multiple times, told his men who could have done it multiple times, no, this is the Lord's timing. And, you know, and he realized that it was a training process, but just the value of that, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, I think, you know, our longevity here that we've had with staff and pastors is a testament to the people who we serve, who are great people to serve and who encourage us. But unlike, you know, in a church, it's just, you would assume that the person, you know, moving out, unless there's been a moral failure, unless he's 90 and just can't let go of the ball. You know, you would assume that they're doing a decent job, or else, you know, your church leadership would have said goodbye somehow. So, like Ed said, if people become, you know, we have a shared leadership here, which is good, but people still, they get attached to people. That's just the way it is. And so, you know, unlike our, you know, how our country works in government, every 4 years you're going to pass the mantle to somebody, or you could pass the mantle to somebody. You might reelect somebody, or even the third time now you might reelect somebody. I won't go there. But,
dark road.
Yes, dark road. But what happens in that situation is, you know, and imagine this happening in a church where you get up and say, "Hey, Pastor Rick's thinking of transitioning. We got 2 candidates going to run now for senior pastor. They got, you know, 2 years now to campaign. You know, they're going to say all kinds of negative things about each other in order to get in that position. Then we're all going to vote, and then you're all going to get on board and like the person who got elected.
And it's
so, you know, how the church works is just so different from that, and it needs to be. Else you can't even imagine that scenario in church. To think. Church is built on the unity of the Spirit, so we're trying to keep the unity of the Spirit. So we have to carefully walk through how, and every church can do it just a little bit differently. But I think it's tough in some denominational circles where the district head just decides, time for you to leave and move. It don't matter what the congregation really thought, just time. So, you know, every church can do it a little differently, but I think, you know, the time factor plus the honoring of the person who's being, you know, either moved to a different position or out or whatever, it all needs to be done carefully, because you want the unity of the Spirit to continue. And I think that's been a strength here, that, you know, that's been tested in the past, but I think it's been a strength that, you know, the board works slowly. They want unanimity as much as possible, and it's not quick process. It doesn't
Yeah.
need to be. So all that to say, yeah, it's good.
For sure. So as we wrap up, I'm gonna ask each of you to maybe share about one of these different people, because we saw in 2 Kings 5 the story of Naaman, a pagan warrior, leader of the army who had led raids and battles against Israel, is afflicted with leprosy, and he is encouraged by a young servant girl that he had taken captive from Israel in one of his raids and battles, to go seek healing from Elisha. And, then we see Naaman's servant come into play in the whole process. And we look at Naaman and what we learned from him, but also Gehazi, or how do you pronounce? Is that
Gehazi, whichever you want.
Gehazi,
Yeah,
whatever.
We'll go with whatever.
And so at the end, we see that we can learn a lesson from him as well. And so in this chapter, really, Elisha has a role, but the lessons that we learn are from the other people that are involved, Right. And so I don't care who speaks to what, but what are some of the lessons that we learn? You can choose. We don't have to go in order of the story, but you can choose one of these four and just speak to what do you feel God was teaching you from, Rick's sermon this past week, in reference of a lesson that you could learn from either the servant girl, Naaman's servant, Naaman himself, or Gehazi.
Well, I'll go. I'll
He's
start off
writing
with
his notes. He better go.
I'll start off with the first character.
Okay,
that, Rick started with.
We had good time talking about her.
Yeah, I
last
know.
week.
You guys
Yeah,
had like.
no, Naaman.
Oh, I started
Naaman,
with the young
okay.
Yeah, you started with
I
Naaman.
thought you were going to talk about the
No,
servant
you started
girl
with Naaman,
because-
then you said I'll come back to him,
Yeah,
but you
right,
started.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, I had
Naaman was
to.
your first character.
Yes.
Yeah. No, Naaman is just such a great character that shows God can capture anyone's heart.
Yes.
No one is too far gone.
Yeah.
He
And
was
then
not
use them.
going looking for God at all. He
No.
was looking for his problem to be solved.
Yeah. And
know.
it just goes to show you, and it's a good reminder, we are all God's enemy because of sin. Scripture
Yeah.
tells us that. You were once, far away. We were God's enemy because of sin. But yet, because of God's gracious love, I think he intentionally put the leprosy upon Naaman. I have no doubt that was a God-given, what would have been a curse to man was a blessing from God.
Yeah.
Because it turned his heart. And Naaman's just a great character of showing no one is too far gone, and God is can use anyone. And he's a great example of that I believe that there were believers of the one true God that came from his household from then on, because he was fully committed to following after Israel's God from that point on.
Yeah.
And I think Pastor Rick did a great job. Immediately, he is transformed and ready to serve God, and that is his first concern once he's healed. Is, hey, can I be forgiven for going into these false gods' temples now that I know aren't real?
Yeah.
Can you forgive me for that? But I'm taking dirt home because I want to build an altar, knowing that this is it. There's no one else.
Yeah.
So he's a great example for everyone, I think.
For sure.
Yep.
And that no one's too far
Too far
away.
gone, yeah,
And
yeah.
God's love is for all.
For all, yeah.
You
It's-
know.
it's powerful.
I'll go. You go next. I'll take whoever you don't.
Okay, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Well, I just love the servant girl,
Yeah.
and I thought Rick brought this out real well.
Yeah.
She could have been really bitter. She could be sitting there in Aram, just angry, resentful. I've been abused, mistreated. Where is God? But she sees a need in Naaman's life, and even though this man has ruined her life, she reaches out and says, somebody in Israel could help you.
Yeah.
Just give her a great deal of credit. And it was interesting, and won't say any names here, but one of the responses in prayer on Sunday morning that came up to me and a couple of the elders was someone who is struggling with bitterness. and anger at the man who has really, really hurt her life.
Yeah.
So I think the Lord spoke through this servant girl, to say, "Hey, if you got bitterness or unforgiveness, get it out, get rid of it, because God, even though your circumstances are not what you would have chosen,
Yeah.
God has a purpose for you, just like He had the purpose for that servant girl."
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think someone separately came up and asked for prayer to get over bitterness, as well. And like we said when we were talking, it's like the old saying, it's like drinking poison, expecting someone else to die or be harmed. And it's you can't control the other person, you can't control what they're going to do, but there is a call in Scripture to forgive. And man, is that difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I want to talk about Gehazi. First, I want to
Yeah.
go back to the servant girl because we had a good discussion in staff meeting
Yeah.
last
Yeah,
week.
yeah.
And strangely enough, because Pastor Steve was really like, they must have been treating this girl pretty well for her to do something like this. Yeah. And of course, I didn't find any other commentator who thought that at all. But
That is so weird.
But no, I strangely came away agreeing with you in this sense. There is no other explanation for how she acted. There's only two. Either they treated her really well, or that God was at work in her life.
Yeah.
Because I thought back to, how can you explain the situation I thought about was when Corey Ten Boom has to forgive her, the guards. She has to, and who could explain that?
Oh, sure.
Who could you wouldn't say, well, the guards must have treated her really well at the end for her to be able to. No, you could only explain that moment that, hey, God had to be doing something in her heart.
It was a supernatural
work,
yeah.
And that's what made me really, maybe it's not all credit to the girl, but it's credit to God for He was supernaturally working in her heart. I think she did have godly parents who, taught her that, God's gracious and compassionate to us. We need to be gracious and compassionate to them, because as you look more at the just what would happen in those raids, they were just ruthless. That's the way they were to each other. So I came away with the same thing. Either you only got two conclusions there. Either they really treated this girl really nice, or God did a supernatural work.
Yeah.
And I think God did a supernatural work. The thing about Gehazi was that I think I saw this time more than any other time was, and I think I said this Sunday, but if God didn't want to give him even a second chance, He would have just went right to, boom, here it is. You're going to be leprous and your whole descendants. But Elisha gives him a chance to at least come clean when he says, "Where you been?" I think he still would have suffered some consequences, for what he did, but nothing like was handed down to him. But it was just God out of His compassion and mercy, even when we're deeply in sin and aren't just so deep in it that our conscience isn't even working. He still sometimes gives us opportunity. A lot of times through His Word, reading it, sometimes through other people. He still gives us that chance to come to repentance before you heap on yourself even more consequences, not only for you, but for your family and people around you. So it just kind of struck me how God gave even him another opportunity, and of course it struck me again that how much of the supernatural work of God he saw and just pretty much walked away from it. So Satan can take down any of us at any time, and yet God is still gracious to say, "Hey, I'll give you a chance." Okay, it reminded me of God coming to Adam and Eve in the garden when they're hiding and saying, "Hey, where are you guys? What's going on?"
And then why are you hiding?
Yeah, why are you hiding? Right? Here's your chance to come out.
And right away,
and they came out and blamed one another.
Yes, so Naaman's servant has always been the one that I've appreciated most in this story, and because it's not one's more important than the other. If the servant girl would have never spoken up, Naaman would have never went.
Right.
But Naaman was gone. He was leaving. He was mad. Elisha didn't have, the Elisha wouldn't even come out and see him and meet him, and he gave him some ridiculous go wash in the Jordan 7 times and then you'll be clean, and and it's like, what are you doing? I could have stayed and done it in 2 clean rivers back home. Like, what is this instruction? He's irate, lets his anger take over, and he's out of there.
Turned and went off in a rage.
Yes, and maybe I can relate to that sometimes, when I don't get what I think I deserve or whatever. And the servant, who there's no indication that he was anything but a pagan, because with the other servant girl, it was identified that she was an Israelite. So this servant is not identified as anybody but a servant. And God used him to graciously speak truth, all for God's glory.
Yeah.
Sure.
And to continue to draw Naaman to himself. And I love, it was so quick, it was so subtle, but that servant, just speaks the truth to him.
Yeah.
That God uses to then bring Naaman to actually do what he said, even though he's not happy about it.
Yeah.
And if that servant would not have spoken up, then Naaman would have just went back, and so I love the lesson of, one, because I identify with the getting angry. When someone humbly, graciously speaks truth into my life, I better listen.
Whether they're a Christian or not.
And so if it's God's truth, God will use, and we've already established, God will use whoever he sees fit to accomplish what he wants. And so to humbly accept that truth being spoken into my life, it's a great reminder to be aware. And also, it's, again, God will use anyone, and I often, again, there's these auxiliary questions, but I often wonder, whatever happened to the servant? Did he give his life to Christ? Like, did he, because he saw what happened with his master, then did he follow the one true God?
Yeah.
And so, we don't get that detail, but it does make me wonder, because so often when the head of a household, would then follow Yahweh, it would usually be a ripple effect throughout that household.
Yeah.
And so
the text says, then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God and stood before him and said what they did. So the servant definitely was
there and present.
there.
Yeah. So he saw it all. So
great.
Well, thank you guys very much. I know that there's a lot more we could have talked about with Elisha, but it's good to dive in. And again, I encourage you to dive in yourself. Get in the Word. Have that person you can talk through with Scripture. And, maybe it's your accountability partner. Maybe it's someone in a small group or your Sunday school class. But it's great to continue to dive into the Word and seek truth from the Holy Spirit and each other as fellow believers. And, as Proverbs 27 says, iron sharpens iron. And so encourage you to continue doing that. Thank you so much for joining us on the Federated Squared Circle, Wrestling with God's Word. We'll see you later.